is 1:02. We're going to go ahead and start. Anyone who wanders in, I've already said it a couple of times, but for anyone who did miss it, we will be discussing 9/11. If you are uncomfortable with discussions of 9/11, this is your chance to leave. Do what you need to do.
Yeah, we will.
Fair warning.
We will take no offense. We understand
this
that
is also, given that this is a comic book panel, we will be showing clips from some of the movies. There will be violence. You will see someone get shot.
So there may be some spoilers, and I'm going to try to run down the list of movies that we are probably going to discuss. So, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man from 2002, Batman and Robin, which, like, no spoilers there, whatever. And also, like, I don't think it's possible to spoil a piece of shit that's like polishing a turd. Then we're going to talk about some of the recent movies. So Iron Man, The Dark Knight, Man of Steel, and The Avengers. So those are the big 7, I think, that we're going to talk about.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's get started. So the title of today's panel is Burdened with Glorious Purpose. Ayo. 21st Century Zeitgeist and the Shifting Perspectives in Portrayal of Marvel and DC Superheroes on the Big Screen. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but we have figured out that if you make long titles with big words in them, you're more likely to get a panel slot at a convention.
Yep.
Don't laugh, this is true.
We tried to give like a very like generic layperson title once, and we got The Back Baby Room with the like, here's how to do a panel description taped to the table.
Like, thanks, we've done this before. I have a PhD.
Yes. So, before we start, introductions as to why you should listen to us and not other random people. Hi, my name is Caitlin. I'm an art historian and art restorer. I'm particularly interested in how we tell each other things without saying it. Basically, the book Understanding Comics is one of my favorite things in the entire world. I'm also very interested in applying fine art theory to things that are not traditionally considered fine art, like comic books and video games. This person is my husband.
Hello. That's it. That's my introduction. No, I mean, but seriously, so my name is right there, bottom right. If you can pronounce that, kudos to you. I'll buy you a drink later. I'm not going to give you any hints, though. My background is that I'm a musicologist. I have a PhD in music history. My specialty is jazz from 1930 to 1958. But apart from that, I'm also interested in film music, in video game music, and specifically how they communicate ideas without using verbal communication methods. Okay, so let's get started. What we're going to begin with is kind of a brief rundown of the philosophical underpinnings of the American comic mythos. Particularly, a lot of comics are a reflection of the political standpoint from the decade or from the year in which they are created. And a lot of this really tracks with a lot of American politics, particularly American politics going all the way back to the idea of American exceptionalism. So I like to start this from the standpoint of like saying that comics are almost exclusively, like superhero comics specifically, are almost exclusively an American invention. They certainly have some degree of popularity in countries outside of the United States, but in the United States they were born, in the United States they are made popular, and in the United States they shall forever be ensconced as one of the probably leading forms of entertainment.
And in the United States is where they draw their sort of cultural references. Mm-hmm. So we will inherently understand certain things in comics because we have been raised from birth to understand that, like, hey, this means good and this means bad, and we just know it. Someone who is not from the States may struggle a little bit more with understanding what exactly the comic is trying to say because they did not grow up with that nonverbal communication of this is good and this is bad.
And a lot of symbolism in comics specifically is something that's very closely connected to a lot of the American exceptionalist aesthetics. So for instance, like the very core idea of American exceptionalism is that America is great because it is. So the values, politics, and history of America are such that they are seen as unique in the greater realm of world politics and histories because, you know, it's a country that's, and, you know, we can certainly understand that this is all being said very, very tongue-in-cheek considering the events of the last, like, 6 years, right? But we are still very firmly convinced that America is the nation of liberty. It was founded on unalienable rights, and there's, like, a certain allowance that's being made for every single person in this nation to be equal, et cetera, blah, blah. If you buy into this bullshit, great, fine, whatever. The point is that these are the underpinnings for this. So we have characteristics of individual liberty, republicanism, equality before law, laissez-faire economics. And so one of the things that you can see actually is in this painting, and I regrettably don't have a way to make that brighter for you, but this painting of American Progress that's currently at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles has one very particular interesting detail in it, right? It's this depiction of America as Columbia, right? And it's leading the explorers westward towards expansion, towards progress, towards all of these other things. And the way it's cast is kind of like towards the east we have the dawning sun and there's light, and towards the west we have the darkness, and we're kind of pushing into the darkness and we're trying to stave off the darkness as best as we can. And
America is so great, we need to be touching 2 oceans.
Right. But, the symbolism in the visual imagery of this painting is pretty clear. And I believe that this was one of the many images that eventually inspired comic books to become what they are.
Yes. Fun fact, visual media evolves off of older things. So there are tropes in the visual language of comic books that come from, like, the Middle Ages. We all just building on top of each other in everything that we do. Yeah,
absolutely. Representational art is something that has a very storied history, but it is distinctly an American invention to create this kind of super heroic imagery of America triumphing over everything, or just this abstract concept of like Columbia and the American heroism and manifest destiny and things like that.
If you want a really good example of this, go play BioShock Infinite.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Okay, and then a few other philosophical underpinnings, of course, are the Malthusian economics of Thomas Robert Malthus, the author of an essay on the principle of population, who basically said that he wrote this during the height of the Enlightenment, where progress was just starting to ramp up, and so everything was just peachy keen and great, and everybody's like, yay, we're finally going to have food for people. And Malthus was like, okay, but hear me out. Like, what happens when population reaches a limit such that food supplies cannot sustain them? How about we just, like, I don't know, cull the poor? That's fine, right? Like, that's and he said this with like zero irony, which is eventually why Jonathan Swift went on and made a modest proposal, right? How about instead of doing that, how about we actually eat the poor? Right? So he basically gave this warning of a perceived future where the population's increase is going to outstrip the available resources. And 2 solutions were basically provided a check to lower birth rates. So basically, like, don't let poor people breed. And the other one is just a positive check to increase mortality rates. So, like, let poor people die.
Yep.
Right? I'm sensing a hush in the room because you guys are like, processing this. You're like, wait a second.
What does this have to do with comic books?
No, it's not even that, but it's like you guys are like, wait a second. Haven't I seen this back in 2021?
Yes. Anyway.
And then the other one, of course, and I think that this, by and large, is the largest influencing factor in American politics and economics, is none other than Elisa Zinoviev Rosenbaum, also known as Alice O'Connor, also better known as Ayn Rand. Okay, so collective booze.
Yes, yes, yes.
So the author of Atlas Shrugged essentially suggested that wealth makes you a good person. The fact that you're a good person means that you're going to be rewarded with wealth. So it's a kind of a very circular logical argument, but essentially consciousness is the faculty of perceiving that which exists, is the other big underpinning of objectivism. Economic objectivism is the statement that objectivism regards capitalism as the social system most beneficial to the poor, but mostly as a moral social system. So in other words, it's moral to be rich. It's upright to be rich. And then, of course, that transmits into, if you're rich, you are somehow specially endowed.
Yes. If you're rich, you're a good guy, which means everything you do is good, and therefore fine.
The rich cannot be flawed.
Yeah. You might see how that's a problem.
Okay, good. So these are the philosophical underpinnings which we are going to see over and over again in a lot of the films and a lot of the comic book media that we're going to be looking at. They're not necessarily going to be explicitly stated this way, but I'm sure that for some of you, particularly those of you familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially the Malthusian economics, are already ringing some distant bells with Thanos, right? So, and this is not accidental. When the Russos made the adaptation of Thanos for the MCU, they were very specifically looked to like a perversion of Malthusian economics to their absolute core negativity. So let's talk about the timeline for American comics, like just kind of like how did we get to where we are? I'm going to run through this really, really quickly. So 1897 to 1938 is regarded as the Platinum Age, which is the gradual introduction of concepts of sequential arts and emphasis on humor. So it's the funnies, right? It's the funny papers. This is slightly before the birth of the superhero. The Golden Age of comics is widely regarded as the suffusion of patriotic principles of American exceptionalism and America as a policeman of the world. This coincides historically with World War II, and one of the first two heroes that are believed to have been like kind of in the super canon are of course Captain America and Superman, both of whom were invented by Jewish artists, right? Superman was
It's created specifically because these Jewish artists saw what was happening in Europe. Were like, we can't do anything about it, so they made a guy who could.
Yeah. So this is largely vicarious living, right? So like
Yes.
we are currently being exterminated in concentration camps. Let's see if we can get back at them by creating essentially a power fantasy.
Yes, exactly.
And then 1950 to 1955 is the Atomic Age, which is the modernization of thematic content, rise of space serials, decline of superheroes. So this is largely like the Forbidden Planet era. We have like lots of like
Buck Rogers.
yeah, Buck Rogers, like robots, Flash Gordon, things like that.
It became a lot less about, America needs to police the world and we need to just
Go to
do
space.
more technology.
Yeah, and this is, of course, roughly around the time the Cold War starts. So, like, one of the big underpinnings of the Cold War was the space race. It makes sense, right? Exploration is the word of the day.
Comic books have always been a place for people who did not have a voice in the mainstream to discuss what was going on and how the politics of the world were affecting them.
1956 to 1970 is the Silver Age, and so comics are available in greater quantity, little quality, and this is what Will Jacobs of DC Comics has said. So this is where you get the really, really dumb Batman stuff, like,
This is when Captain America was a werewolf.
It's true. Have any of you guys seen this website called Super Dickory? Okay, Super Dickory is like excerpts from Superman comics where he's just a complete asshole. Like, he just leaves Lois, like straight up ditches Lois at the altar. This is from this time period. And this is also where the CCA, the Comics Creative Alliance, I think, Comics Code Authority, thank you. Yeah, the CCA is basically there to dictate what can and cannot be included into comic books. And they exist for a good long time, I think until like the mid-1990s, at which point they kind of dissolve and comics start policing themselves.
I think the last group to ditch it was in 2013.
Yeah, DC, I think, was the last one.
Yeah.
Good. In the 1970-1980s, widely regarded as the Bronze Age, return of superheroes with a pivot towards darker plot lines that generally also includes socially aware issues. So emphasis on social, political, and economic content. So, this is the time when Captain America joins up with Falcon to patrol, wait for it, Harlem. Of white guys patrolling Harlem and preventing crime. Okay, not sus at all. Good. 1985 to 1991, Copper Age, DC Universe is streamlined. So this is where we have Crisis on Infinite Earths. This is also the darker and grittier deconstruction of existing tropes. This is where we're starting to re-examine superheroes and being like, hey, maybe all of these heroes that we've been looking at, they might not be all that great.
This is also when we start questioning why our government is doing certain things.
Right.
This is when we find out that, the government was killing people because they could.
Yeah, this is roughly when we had the crisis in Nicaragua. So some shitty shit's going down and we're like,
hey,
cool,
guys.
The Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah.
Right? The less we say about the Dark Knight Returns, the better. Now, modern age is 1991 to 2021, and of course there are some divisions in there, but generally speaking, modern age is the further diversification of the genre. We have much more emphasis on inclusivity and representation, but we also have the rise of anti-heroes. So this is where we have a lot of indie publishers specifically doing things like Irredeemable and Empire and things like that, where we really kind of look at the pathos and the tragedy of being, the burden essentially of being a superhero. This is where Burden with Glorious Purpose it gets its title. And then we also have cross-media cinematic adaptations taking shape. So this is where we have the rise of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the DC Extended Universe, and so forth and so on. Okay, good. So now let's get down to brass tacks. Primary themes of pre-9/11 comic book media. And when I
now
say
that we've given you the college lecture about all the things we want you to keep in your brain while we talk about comic book movies, let's talk about comic book movies.
Yeah, so I know, right? This is great. So what I want to specifically focus on here is that we're almost exclusively going to be addressing cinematic adaptations of comics. And when I say adaptation, this is actually kind of an important point because an adaptation does not mean a one-to-one translation. So a lot of these things are not necessarily trying to recreate comics on the big screen. What they're trying to do is they're trying to take some core aesthetics or some core concepts from comics and reframe them for a different medium, but also for the issues that are more relevant and much more pressing to their creation. So, what are some of the core ideas behind pre-9/11 comic book media? Well, movies were still kind of trying to figure a lot of this comic book stuff out. And because comic books have had a long history of being for kids, which, you know, technically they are. Let's not argue that point. Movies kind of tried to do the same thing. So they tried to make them kid-friendly. So even like the darker ones, like Tim Burton's Batman and Batman Returns, are still PG-13 rated. They're still very much sanitized for children. And
I mean, how many of you have worked in a movie theater and had to be screamed at because someone brought their kids to a Deadpool movie, despite the fact that it says it's R-rated and not for kids?
Yep, there you go. Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Everyone thinks that comic books are for kids, even if they deal with a lot of non-kid friendly like tropes. Yeah. They're still kid material to some degree.
Yeah, and the pre-9/11 comic books movies basically just take the barest essentials of what comic books have been about and distill them to just like the foundational stuff. So like exceptionalism versus nihilism. The good guys are the good guys. The bad guys are the bad guys. So like if you watch Batman Forever or Batman and Robin, Batman is goofy as hell, sure, but he's still very clearly the good guy. Like he doesn't have any of that moral pathos or any of the complexity or any of the nuance that comic book Batman has. Like this is a far cry from even Frank Miller's Batman, right? Which is to say nothing of the more advanced...
He's good because we said he's good, and he punches people in the face who are bad because we said they're bad.
Precisely.
So that makes him good and them bad. Don't question it.
Right. But also, like, in addition to that, it's still capitalizing on some of those old ideas from the ethos of comic books, particularly from Randianism. So supers are greater than, right? That basically means that they are inherently intended to be better than everybody else. They're great because they're super, and they're super because they're great. So, like, you know, I don't necessarily want to point out the obvious, but Batman being a billionaire is kind of a commentary on this, right? Like, this dude could give all the money in the world to Gotham City to fix all of its problems like that overnight, and instead he buys himself a bat suit and beats up mentally ill people. You know, then there is also a binary relationship between chaos and order, and they're seen as polar opposites during this time period. There's a clear definition of what a good guy is and what a bad guy is. The good guys are the good guys because they look like the good guys. The bad guys are the bad guys because they look like not the good guys. These comics do not really do socio-political commentary. The ones that try do it so badly that they are basically stricken from the record, like, for instance, Steel with Shaquille O'Neal. You may remember that cinematic abortion.
It was,
because it was bad. The one that's actually good, and I might kind of talk about that later, is Blade. The first Blade is actually good.
But Blade was not made to be a comic book movie.
Right.
Blade was a movie inspired by a comic book, which was very different at the time.
Right. There's also like a distinct lack of representation. So like comic book heroes generally tend to be white, and that again is why like Blade being like he's actually represented as a black person in the movie, which is kind of an amazing thing for this time period. There is also lighter, less serious, more jocular tone. Again, I'm going to show you a clip from Batman and Robin in just a second. You're going to see exactly what's going on there. And so goofiness and self-awareness in writing are basically non-existent. Goofiness exists in self-awareness. There is none.
Yeah, it's goofy. We're not aware. We're not pretending that it's goofy. We're not going to let you know that it's goofy. We're going to pretend this is serious.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's go ahead and take a watch.
Hi, Freeze. I'm Batman.
He just skates down this motherfucker and drop kicks him in the chest.
You are not sending me to the cooler.
Meanwhile, Mr. Freeze, who's one of the most tragic supervillains in the entirety of DC canon, even by this point, is making fucking ice puns. Like, fuck you, dude.
Yes.
and then meanwhile, Robin rides in on his fucking motorcycle, like, what up, dude? Cowabunga! He actually says cowabunga in this one. Like, he does. He fucking says cowabunga. Okay, cool. Moving on. I know, it's truly amazing, isn't it? Okay, great. So let's carry on. Okay. Now that we got that out of our system. So this is where shit gets serious, right? 2001 to 2002. This is the transitional period where comics finally realized that, oh yeah, we can do good movies and still be comic book inspired. So Sam Raimi's Spider-Man from 2002 is seen as kind of the seminal transitional film between the pre-9/11 era and the post-9/11 era. And I generally put, like, I know it came out in 2002, but just go with me on this one. The production cycle for this film was roughly 3 years long. So the film started production before 9/11, but midway during its release, they had to do a number of things to modify the release schedule, to modify some of the promotional materials. So in that sense, it's still very much tinged by some of the events of 9/11. So,
and you'll notice that a lot of the movies we talk about are a good few years after 9/11, simply because the production cycle is so long that a movie that came out in 2010 was probably in production in 2007.
Exactly. So this movie capitalized on the previous generation's many, many strengths. So it borrowed a lot of the cinematic techniques, and obviously Sam Raimi's already a really good director. Like, he knows his stuff. But he took a lot of the things that he's done with Evil Dead and Army of Darkness and kind of transposed it onto this. And this expanded a lot of the ideas about what comic book movies could be, in that it included a lot of socio-political commentary. It paid lip service to the inherently goofy nature of comics without making it over-the-top goofy. So, like, it kind of realized, it's very self-aware about the fact that, yes, there is a guy in a red and blue basketball suit that just bounces around New York City using spider webs and, like, kicks a green guy on a fucking jetpack in a face, right? But at the same time, it also doesn't dwell on those things. Like, those factors in Spider-Man the movie are kind of secondary to the actual character drama. And it's certainly due in no small part to the exceptionally well-acted scenes between, like, Tobey Maguire and Uncle Ben and so on.
Yeah, so this is where we really see the shift in comic book movies from heroes punch things, so we're going to have a lot of scenes of punching things and a lot of action scenes, to heroes are people who we're going to focus on their story as people, and the punching is ancillary.
Yeah, just to
it's still cool, but it's ancillary.
Yeah, just to kind of fast forward a couple of years, Spider-Man 2, which I think is my favorite one, it has roughly, like, of the 2 hours and 10 minutes runtime, I think only like 30 minutes of that is actually Spider-Man shit. The rest is just character drama, and it's some of the best writing and some of the best direction ever. Like, that movie gripped me, particularly the bits with Peter and Octavius when they interact. Like, those were just chef's keys. Okay, so it also deconstructs and subverts tropes of the original source material in comic books. But the other thing that it does that's really important, it definitely leans into a lot of the things that kind of unify us as people, particularly in aftermath of 9/11. So this is where it gets really interesting. Do you guys remember this scene from this movie?
He's not gonna make it! He's gonna make it!
It's time to die!
Come on up here, dumb guy! I got a little something for you!
Kick your freaking ass!
Leave Spider-Man alone! You gonna pick on a guy trying to save a bunch of kids?
Oh yeah, I got something for your ass! You mess with Spidey, you mess with New York!
You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us!
So notice that the really interesting thing about the scene is that Spider-Man defeats the Green Goblin not by being better than him, but by having the support of New Yorkers. And they're portrayed like in a very stereotypical New Yorker fashion, like, hey, how you doing, right? Like all this stuff. But just think about what a huge difference that is between this movie and everything that came before this, right? So the good guy isn't actually super because he's somehow better than everybody. He's super because he has the support and the adoration of everyone around him, who in fact are the ones that kind of deliver the crippling blow to his antagonist. Everything that happens after this, like the part where Green Goblin actually like self-detonates with his bombs, that's kind of inconsequential. This is the heart of this movie, right? And this was added after 9/11 because this is kind of where we were. For a brief shining moment after September 11th attacks, this is what was kind of the general ethos. Like, there was
particularly in New York.
Yeah, there was granted, there was a kind of polarization with the outside world, but as the United States, for like a brief minute, we kind of came together and unified in our solidarity against. Well, let's not get into that just now, because we are gonna get dark, my dudes, in just a second. But Spider-Man really does represent kind of like this incredible shift in the aesthetics of comic book films. So after this, we get the shit show period, as I like to refer to it, which is 2002 to 2008. Now, granted, there were some good comic book movies. The first X-Men film is still pretty darn good. The second one is not terrible. The third one, we don't talk about that one. But there's basically kind of a general consensus that we're just not going to talk about 9/11 in movies. And this is also true in a bunch of other stuff that was going on TV. Like, for instance, everything that was in New York. Like, they kind of pay it lip service, but like Friends don't talk about 9/11.
Sex in the City, there is a single lip service moment.
At the end of season 5, they're like, yes, this is dedicated to the city of New York. Like, thanks.
Which, I mean, was kind of partially due to the fact that how TVs and movies are made. They're made years before they end up on screen. I think Sex and the City, they film when they film it, it's, I think, over a year before you see it on your TV. Yes. So by the time they were filming that season, they couldn't have really addressed anything to do with 9/11. So it's either they pay lip service or they don't say anything at all.
Right. Then we have a tonal reversion to darker, more edge shit, like, for instance, Ben Affleck's Daredevil. And these movies are still largely made to be less than serious, but they're still doing their darndest to convince us that they are, because, look, we have Ian McKellen as Magneto, Colin Farrell as Bullseye, and then Ang Lee, the director of The Ice Storm, is directing The Hulk, which, granted, I will say this, Ang Lee's The Hulk is not all terrible. It's doing some interesting things. But more on that later, maybe. We'll see. Okay, and this is when we finally get into the current generation of films, starting with 2008. So Iron Man was a big, huge game changer, right? Because this was not only a good comic book movie, this is also just a good movie. And this is also roughly around the time when we started consolidating things into cinematic universes. So there's a sense of brand integrity about this. Like, there's something about the Marvel media from this point on that kind of like suffused it together and made it be one contiguous thing.
This is where Marvel really started to shine because, as my dad has always said, DC has the better characters, Marvel has the better stories. Marvel has always written really good character-driven stories, which means that you have to buy 20 comic books to get the whole story, which doesn't work so well for, a single one-off movie. But when they can make 20 movies in a row with all of these characters and really explore all of these characters, suddenly you have a cinematic universe and you're basically God.
Yeah, and a lot of these ideas are capitalized upon over the course of several movies. Like, this is one of the advantages of having a cinematic universe. So, all right, so let's talk about it. So obviously the two big ones are, well, there's really only one big one. DC Universe is like still trying to catch up. The less we say about it, the better. But anyway, so there's definitely a sense of acknowledgement of weighty world issues, although they don't necessarily always engage with them. They kind of pay lip service to a lot of these things, like, yes, terrorisms exist. And then they're like, cool, but we're not going to talk about this. Anyway, Iron Man.
Yes.
And they're also grappling with the implications of real-world politics in this cinematic universe. Like, for instance, a lot of the things that happen in Iron Man and beyond that, like, for instance, in Captain America Winter Soldier, which, to my mind, is still one of the better first-generation Marvel films that have been made, end of story. They do talk about these things, and they do engage with them. There's also, like, this idea of comics adaptation serving as catharsis, because we have, at this point, are about 10 years out from 9/11, and it's generally becoming more and more acceptable to process it and to talk about it.
Yes. Sort of directly post 9/11, a lot of media was not made about it because, again, production cycles. And then sort of in that, 2005 to 2008, there was a little bit of talking about it, but it's like we didn't want to address it. We didn't want to acknowledge that we had been hurt, so we just didn't. And we sort of had our toys and we had our power fantasies, but we never really directly interacted with this trauma of 9/11 in our media. And it's when we get into about 2008 and there's a little bit of distance between us and the trauma that we really start to see media that addresses it in some way.
Yeah, you might have noticed very similar things in movies like after the Vietnam War. Like, for instance, Vietnam War in 78? 75. It wasn't until like the mid 80s that we actually started doing things like Rambo First Blood and then Rambo 2 and Chuck Norris's like Delta Force movies and all that shit, right? Which, you know, I mean, they're goofy action films, but they are inherently seen as processing the trauma. And in some cases, like kind of going back for a round two and just like sucker punching Ho Chi Minh in his face, right? And this is very similar here, although not maybe in such a literal sense.
Yeah.
So a lot of these comics adaptations are also now taking on this life of authorship. So like, you know, Jon Favreau directing Iron Man very much, because Marvel kind of gave him a carte blanche. They were like, oh, you think you can like make this fucking like comic book movie and make it really good? Go ahead. Here's $1 trillion. And he was like, sweet, I'm going to make the best movie ever.
Yeah, because
And he
Marvel
did.
Marvel Cinema had no faith in it.
Yeah,
So they're like, we'll try. This is a last ditch attempt to make movies to make money.
Exactly. And all right. So now let's talk about the examples of this stuff. So like, how exactly do these movies process 9/11? This is where it gets interesting because each one of them kind of addresses a separate facet, and it addresses these facets in very distinct and different ways.
So I just want you guys to look. Do you remember what the poster for Batman Forever looked like? And Spider-Man looked like? What these posters looked like? Now look at these comic book movie posters. Yeah, it's a little different now.
Yeah, with these, I just caution you guys, be careful, don't cut yourselves on all that edge.
Yes,
This is
it
true.
does. There's a
true.
reason,
Yeah.
but yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about Iron Man. So directed by Jon Favreau, 2008. Obviously, I don't have to ruin the plot for you guys because you can look it up yourselves.
Yes.
But at one point, Iron
Fair
Man,
warning, depictions
Yeah.
of violence. You will watch someone get shot.
having escaped from the Golmira, it's totally Afghanistan. Having escaped from the terrorist, the Ten Rings. That's what
In
they're called. yeah.
unspecified
Yeah.
desert country
Yes.
that's not
That's
Afghanistan, we
definitely not
promise.
Afghanistan. They're not the Taliban. They're the Ten Rings, you guys. It's totally true.
It's totally different.
So having escaped them, he goes back because he's like, oh, they're doing a terrorism over there. I should.
And I'm the
that
big
up.
rich man with the big guns. I
Yeah.
have to fix
So
this.
this is the scene. Here they are doing a terrorism. What up, bitches? He just straight up murdered that guy and that guy and that guy. These are rubber bullets, guys. Don't worry. They won't kill you. They'll just make you wish it did.
Isakto. Isakto. Isakto.
This is my favorite part right here.
He's all yours.
Pause right there. Let's unpack this.
yes.
Okay, so great scene, right? Like, it's fantastic, it's cathartic, it does exactly what you wanted to do. Iron Man, like, he yeets some guy through a building and just completely ruins his life for the rest of forever. It's awesome. It's good, clean fun. But let's talk about what the implications of the scene are, because everything, as we mentioned, comic books media draws from real-world issues. Whether it's complimentary of those issues or whether it's critical of them, it doesn't matter. It's all inspired by something realistic, something that's actually gone down. So, what did Iron Man just do? What just happened? Any takers?
Yeah.
He straight up violated several international treaties, went into a foreign country, acted as essentially a paramilitary or a combatant. I'm actually going to defer to you if that's the correct terminology. Yeah? So, killed people, and then basically deposed the government, and then left these people on their own. He's all yours, he says. There's also like a very clear indication in this scene that he knows instinctively who the bad guys are. Well, they're the ones with the guns, the Dawe, right? Okay, well, like it's making a really big show of like how he will not harm innocents, but he will absolutely let those innocent people just like rip apart a man with their bare hands. So he's just like, nah, man, I did my thing. Like, all good here. And then he just flies away, right? So he doesn't actually fix anything technically. He just shows up, blows up a bunch of shit, punches a bunch of people in the face, and then goes like, you guys got this? All good. Does this sound like anything that we've already seen circa like 2003?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Mission accomplished. Bush got the parade up and down in the... Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
It's cool. You guys don't actually need to see us. You just need to hear us. This is fine.
Yeah.
I prefer to be in the shadows. But yeah, like, it's exactly what it is. Bush parading up and down the deck of the USS Nimitz in a flight suit, just being like, yay, we did it. And then, like, 2021, we're finally pulling troops out of Afghanistan, and the situation over there is worse than ever. Moving on. Now we get to talk about The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. So you guys are thinking, okay, how could this possibly be a movie about some bad shit? Well, first of all, this movie wears 9/11 on its sleeve. You guys remember the poster for this with the bat symbol burnt into a building? Yeah? You remember this shit right here? Right there? Second from the left? Okay, that's intentional. That's intended to give you 9/11 vibes. So let's talk about this scene here. This is Rachel Dawes' death. This is the aftermath of the explosion. So we have cops pouring water on a burning building.
Which is something you have never seen in a superhero movie prior to this.
Yeah, this kind
You
of
never
like,
see the cleanup.
The Joker planned to be caught. He wanted me to lock him up in the MCU.
So this should look intimately familiar. Very similar to the stuff that I'm showing on the left here. This particular shot right
Dear
here,
Bruce,
this next one, this right here, right?
I need to be honest and clear. I'm going to marry Harvey Dent. I love him, and I want to spend the rest of my...
Regrettably, I don't have a lot of things pulled up from the actual news footage from 9/11, but I figured that's probably for the best because I don't want to like intentionally traumatize anybody. But like the visuals are here, like they're present in the promotional materials for this. They're written all over the visual construct that is this movie. But then also we get to the next scene, which is the high frequency generator computer scene, which is where Batman is basically like, hey, I'm going to use this computer to spy on all of Gotham. And Lucius is like, maybe we shouldn't do that. And Batman's like, you're the one who's in charge of this. Promoted. So let's do this.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Beautiful, unethical, dangerous. You've turned every cell phone in Gotham into a microphone.
And a high-frequency generator receiver.
You took my sonar concept and applied it to every phone in the city. With half the city feeding you sonar, you can image all of Gotham. This is wrong.
I've got to find this man, Lucius.
At what cost?
The database is null key encrypted. It can only be accessed by one person.
This is too much power for one person.
That's why I gave it to you. Only you can use it.
Spying on 30 million people isn't part of my job description.
This is an audio sample. If he talks within range of any phone in the city, you can triangulate his position.
I'll help you this one time. But consider this my resignation. As long as this machine is at Wayne Enterprises, I won't be.
When you're finished, type in your name.
So yeah, this is one of the first things we see of questioning if the ends justify the means.
Right.
Previously, the ends always justified the means because this was the good guy. He's clearly doing a good thing. Like, it's a little iffy, but it's good, right? Because the good guy's doing it.
And to think about the fact that this is very clearly echoing a lot of the things behind the Patriot Act, particularly the maxim of like, well, if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't be worried. Right? And this entire movie kind of brings up a lot of these maxims from post 9/11 Bush era politics. And I'm still unclear if it's trying to critique them or be like, this is a good thing. Because it's very clearly framed kind of like as a morally ambiguous thing, but I have a feeling that Christopher Nolan very much leans on the side of, I agree with these ideas, and I think that these are good ideas. And I think that ultimately the ends justify the means, because so long as there is one bad person out there, so long as this one bad person can do something bad, we can treat this as an absolute certainty that he needs to be caught at any cost. Okay, Avengers 2012. I mean, what do I say? It's just right here. So just in the actual imagery of this movie, just the screens from all of this, Joss Whedon definitely capitalized on a lot of the ideas from the footage of 9/11. So at least visually, this is very clearly intended to be an homage to the 9/11 attacks. But let's take a look at this scene. This is where they assemble for the first time.
What's the story upstairs?
The power surrounding the cube is impenetrable.
Thor's right. We got to deal with these guys.
How do we do this?
As a team, I have unfinished business with Loki.
Yeah? Get in line.
Save it. Loki's gonna keep this fight focused on us, and that's what we need. Without him, these things could run wild.
We got Stark up top. He's gonna need us to...
So, this all seems horrible.
I've seen worse.
Sorry.
No, we could use a little worse.
Stark, we got him.
Banner?
Just like you said.
Then tell him to suit up. I'm bringing the party to you.
I don't see how that's a party.
Dr. Banner. Now might be a really good time for you to get angry.
That's my secret, Cap. I'm always angry.
Cool, pause right there. Do you want to talk about like processing that trauma?
Yeah, I think at the end, keep going.
Okay. So one of the things that's remarkable about this scene is that despite the fact that it's very clearly, from as you've seen from the previous screenshots, imitating a lot of the visual aesthetics, well, not aesthetics, but like a lot of the visual symbolism of 9/11, they're still kind of making light of it, right? So like Joss Whedon's writing is such that it's basically like, hey, we have to diffuse the seriousness with a lot of levity, so hey, let's make some jokey jokes about how this all seems awful.
Yeah, so we're literally going to have a foreign flying thing cut through a building in New York, but bringing the party to you guys, that's fine.
Yeah, that's right. So it's kind of a weird little thing, like where we're trying to heal trauma with humor. And this movie very much capitalizes on this idea where we just, okay, cool, it's been like 10 years. Can we all just like laugh about it now? Which seems really weird to me because, again, just like The Dark Knight, this movie was very, very clearly invested in the aftermath of 9/11. Like there's no mistaking some of the imagery surrounding this movie. Like the final scene where, you know, they're recovering Tony Stark's comatose body from the suit in front of Grand Central Station. And he's just like, oh, it's cool, guys. We can take the day off tomorrow. Anybody want to get food? Right? And they're just kind of like making light about it. Like, ha ha ha, this is all great. And like,
if we
meanwhile,
make jokes about it, it can't have hurt us that
right.
much.
And meanwhile, millions of people probably died in this attack. So, and we're just not going to focus on that. Moving on, shawarma.
Yes.
And then finally, oh boy. Oh man, are you guys ready for some Zack Snyder shit talking? Because I can do this for a while. Okay, awesome. Cool. So to clarify, I want to put this out there. I don't think Zack Snyder is a bad director. I think he's a really competent director who unfortunately has some questionable politics that he feels welcome to smear all over his films. And this isn't just a superhero movies. Like you can find a lot of his auteur politics everywhere that he directs. So obviously the first screenshots kind of need no introduction. Like, I mean, this is 9/11 writ large. Like, we have meteorites hitting tall buildings. I mean, at this point, you can't get much more explicit than this. With Clark and Lois looking at the ruins of Metropolis after the alien device basically all but craters it. But here's the scene that specifically I want to show you.
Guardian en route to Metropolis.
For the record, this is intercut from both Man of Steel and Dawn of Justice.
Target that aircraft.
Anyway, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but like, yeah.
Yeah, so this is where we really see. Remember back in the 90s when destroying buildings was cool? When watching the explosions was fun, and now it's not. Now it's a thing that only the bad guys do.
So, again, you know, I could talk at length about Zack Snyder's personal politics because he is an avowed objectivist. And in a lot of these cases, like the destruction of Metropolis for the sake of Superman's victory is really just a minor inconvenience. And, you know, haha, LOL, millions of people died. But that's okay because he ends up having all his lost moment at the end and having his come to Jesus scream when he kills Zod, because that's apparently the big crux and the big trauma of this film, not like the millions of lives that are lost. So everybody processes this stuff in very different ways, but comic book media really is representative of how we process this stuff, right? Because again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this panel, a lot of the stuff is reflective of contemporary politics. And the further we get away from 9/11 with a lot of these adaptations, the more it becomes kind of a convenient device for us, a very convenient shorthand for us to use as a backdrop for personal drama or personal recovery from trauma.
Yes. How many of you have seen that show Bluey? Bluey. It's a kids show. Okay, so for those of you who haven't seen it, there's a scene where Bluey, who is a child, finds a baby raccoon. And the baby raccoon, they're not sure if it's going to make it. They take the baby raccoon to the vet. The baby raccoon does not make it. That is obviously traumatizing for a child. Mm-hmm. What this show does is it shows how her parents help her deal with it, in that they set up a little vet's office in her living room with all of her toys, and she gets to pick where everything goes, and she gets to pick what everything's done. And her mom comes out and says, oh, you know, the raccoon made it, it'll be okay. And Bluey goes, no, you have to say that it didn't. What happened is that they recreated the scene of trauma entirely in this kid's control. What they did is they took all of her toys, they gave her all of the power so that she could control everything that was happening, and in having that control, she was able to process the trauma and move past it. That is exactly what we're doing with superhero movies.
This is literally...
We are taking our toys, we are taking our big power fantasies, we're saying this is what we wish we could have done, this is what we want to do, and we're recreating this moment of intense trauma for an entire generation and processing it.
Right. And it's not accidental. Like, I mean, I know I mentioned this at the beginning with like the Malthusian politics. It's really not that accidental that Thanos ends up being the bad guy of Infinity War and Endgame, right? Because a lot of the political things at this point, like as we're kind of starting to realize that we are really a society of haves and have-nots on this planet, you know, somebody coming in and basically saying like, hey, let's just get rid of half the people. That's not going to solve the problem, right? That's only going to create additional problems that we're eventually going to have to unfuck down the line. And, you know, there's probably not going to be any unfucking them at the end of the line. So yeah. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. So basically my conclusions on this are that comics are effectively a reflection of the zeitgeist, but also they are there to help us understand generational trauma. They're there to help us understand how to deal with it, and they're also there to help us process this, as Caitlin said. They
give us access to voices we might not have otherwise heard as a way to help process these things.
Right. And by giving us that illusion of control and by creating this power fantasy, it kind of makes us feel as if we're part and parcel of this myth, right? This idea of like the greater than. And ultimately, you know, we are starting to see a trend towards comics is serious literature, and this has been a long time coming. Like, how many of you guys are familiar with Art Spiegelman's Mouse?
Yes.
Okay.
It's middle school reading now.
Yeah. So that shit is dark, right? But it, again, frames a lot of these extremely dark, traumatic issues as basically like cats and mice, right? Which is something that everybody can understand at some level. They're natural enemies, like predators and prey. And I think that the Marvel Cinematic Universe, to some extent, also is kind of doing that, is it's framing a lot of these issues in simpler, more digestible bite chunks for us to kind of gnaw on and be like, okay, cool, we understand this now. Except, like, of course, it can't explain everything, right? These issues are so much more nuanced and complex that any movie could ever do them justice. But, you know, they're trying, at least. Like, it's better than what we had in the 90s, which is, you know, like, bad credit cards. So this idea of fantasy and catharsis vis-a-vis generational trauma after 9/11, like, so where do we go from here after this? Well, I think that comics are going to start becoming more comics are going to start dealing more with issues of like LGBT representation more directly than they have been, because certainly X-Men have been kind of dealing with this idea of the self and the other for a long time. But now that we're actually starting to see a lot of that inclusivity, particularly in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's definitely going to be something that is not discussed, but it's definitely going to be something that's going to be included in these things. Whether or not it's going to be discussed in a meaningful way other than just by name checking it, I really don't know, because these movies are meant to make money, right? They're not intended necessarily to be big, deep discussions of ideas. So, you know, we'll see. I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Personally, I think that we're going to see a lot more of what Disney is doing with like Loki and WandaVision, where bad guys will not be bad guys. Bad guys will be unknowable concepts that we struggle against our entire lives, like grief.
This is true.
We're going to see a big shift from good guys and bad guys to how the fuck do we deal with this?
All right, so we have a few minutes left. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to come up here and ask them. I'm going to put the microphone down there, and if you are not going to stick around, that's great. We appreciate you for coming anyway, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming and listening to our weirdo leftist nonsense.
Thank you, you're too kind.
Oh, there we go. Let me bring this
Yes.
down to you.
True to comic book fashion, I'm going to take a line from Alexander the Great and try and cut through this Gordian knot with a question that I hope gets to the heart of the matter.
Okay.
All right.
Although I'll admit that this will be more reflective of your opinion than any actual objective answers, which may be part of the point. Be honest. Do you guys think that we handled or processed processed the tragedy that is 9/11 correctly through mediums like this? Why or why not?
I think that we're doing our best to. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people who are of my generation and a little bit older do not have a lot of the emotional tools to properly process this trauma.
Yeah.
Please go to therapy, even if you think you don't need it. Oh my God, can it help you? Particularly if you were alive during 9/11 and are dealing with that, go to therapy. I'm serious. So I think, unfortunately, for a lot of these movies, they are just kind of therapy adjacent for a lot of people. I think we're doing our best. I think we're trying. I think that there's a lot in here that can help a lot of people process it. As for whether or not it's perfect, you know, how it should be done, I'm not a therapist. I can't say.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that whether or not we handled it correctly, I don't think we'll know for at least 100 years. Like, we're just now starting to see the long-term effects of our policies from the 1970s and 1980s. And keep in mind that, you know, I am referring to a lot of the really shady shit America did to, like, the various Marxist governments down in, like, Latin America and South America. This is all now chickens coming back to roost from that. 9/11 itself was just the aftermath of that happening to some extent, and we're not going to like start seeing the immediate effects of that for probably another 5 to 10 years. Like this, what's happening right now with everything that's going on, this is just one of the very few early side effects of that incident. And so we probably aren't going to see anything until like maybe late this century, but it's too early to say.
So our children will have better answers than we will, hopefully.
That's how it's supposed to work.
That's right. At the very least, yes.
You know, I study, what's the quote? I study war and economics so that my son can study philosophy so that his son can study art.
Pretty much. All right. Thank you so much. Come on up.
Hello. I love your shirt.
Oh, thank you.
Outfit. This is banging. This is on top.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This is my perfectly heteronormative.
Yes, exactly.
Etc. So I wanted to loop back to this sort of idea you raised with the surveillance state in The Dark
Knight.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, is this in favor of the surveillance state? Is it critiquing it?
Right.
And I feel like what makes a lot of the more successful superhero movies successful is their ability to be functional polysemic texts, to be open to multiple competing interpretations.
Absolutely.
And that, you know, and the ones that fail tend to be stuff like Zack Snyder films, where he's got, this is my message, and this is what it's about.
Yeah, Zack Snyder is not subtle.
If art is not open to multiple interpretations, if it is ham-fisting you with what you're supposed to take away from it, you're never going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Part of what's great about art is that you get to take your own interpretation away from it, and that's part of why comic books, I think, are such a great art medium that we don't discuss enough.
Yeah.
And that seems to be part of, you know, likewise with Iron Man, right? Yeah. Is this a critique of the military-industrial complex? Is this in support of it? Is it both? Is it neither? Depends on how you read the film.
Yes.
And that seems to be one of these kind of key move forwards, right? Was this ability to make these sort of open-ended interpretive texts.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a really good point.
And again, like, I mean, this kind of echoes back to what we talked about in our previous panel, which is this whole idea of authorship and the death of the author. Like, well, what does this mean? Well, what do you want it to mean? Like, how do you read it? Like, you, the reader. So I think it's a great observation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And particularly with film, who is the author? There's like 400 people who made this movie. You know, there's no single...
I will argue that in the case of Christopher Nolan films, there's definitely his authorship is paramount to all of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There is, you know, the director has a high degree of influence, but there are always going to be sort of multiple authored texts.
Yeah.
And,
yes, absolutely. Yep.
So I realize that's not a question. That's just a thought.
No, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
I will pass it forward.
Thank you so much.
Hello.
So I guess my question it's gotten touched on a little bit around. So and you guys were talking about it with like the authorship of movies, how do you reconcile the like idea of us using these movies to process trauma that the United States has gone through with the fact that most movie studios, especially Marvel, have like pretty significant relationships with the U.S. like government and the U.S.
military.
Here's the thing. I can actually talk on this because my dad used to work for the Army, and he used to work particularly for the advertising branch of the Army doing recruiting. So yeah, the military does pay that does get involved in movies a lot. If you'll notice, it hasn't recently. Because the military is very, very specific when getting involved in movies and what is not allowed to be showed, what is not allowed to be used. And because Marvel has been a little more critical lately of large-scale violence, the military has actually not been super involved in a lot of these movies lately.
Yep.
So yeah, and again, it does kind of speak to that, you know, there's multiple interpretations. The military just kind of wants this. The military knows that their best way to recruit is to show things going boom and people looking badass. They know that. They're aware of that. So they want movies where their stuff is in there, where people look cool and things go boom and people look badass.
I guess one counter is like in the WandaVision show, which we brought up, which
yes.
is the villain is, you know, there's a few different things going on, but you do have like positive interpretations of like the FBI with Jimmy Woo showing up,
yes.
which is like a real agency as
right.
opposed to the other agencies like SWORD and stuff that are not.
I will also say that Disney walks a really fine line with a lot of these things. So like think back to that scene from Falcon and the Winter Soldier where they somehow end up in Baltimore. So we live in Baltimore. I'm
not joking. We live like feet from the stadium.
I know what Baltimore cops are like. If they see a black person talking aggressively at a white person, they are going to perforate them full of holes first and ask questions never. Okay? And at this point, like in Falcon, they're like, hey, is this guy bothering you? And he's like, nah, man, he's an Avenger. And they're like, oh, so sorry, Mr. Avenger, sir. That was Falcon. Oh, no, we're so embarrassed. Like, that would never happen. So, like, they love to acknowledge that problems exist, but just up to the line, they're like, yeah, maybe this is a bad thing. Just kidding. Like, we're not going to deal with this, actually.
Keep in mind, we're also talking about a lot of these movies that was sort of when Disney really got their clutches into the Marvel universe, and pre-Disney really controlling what Marvel was doing. So this is a little before we had to get Disney's we must ride the line and get as much money as possible from every single group possible.
Yep. Disney also has to make the United States look good to America, but it also has to make the United States look like a bad guy to China, because a lot of their money is coming from China. So they do have to kind of like walk that fine balance line where they make the United States look good, but not maybe too powerful that China can't possibly like go toe to toe with them economically, right? So there's a lot of different variables at play. And I mean, your question is, I don't think you realize how smart and insightful that question is, because it does not have an easy answer.
Yeah, we could literally talk about this for the next hour. Yeah.
Actually, I'm sure you do realize how smart and insightful that question is. I didn't mean to, like, that seemed like a backhanded compliment. It really wasn't meant to be. It was actually a forehanded compliment, so.
It's just that was a really smart question for the end of a panel.
Yes. Yes.
Hello, next person.
Hi there. Come on up.
So this was kind of briefly brought up in things that you were talking about even just now, and then the title also is talking about burdened with glorious purpose, quoting Loki. So I was curious of what your thoughts are of how the zeitgeist is impacting these current Disney movies.
So I have not watched Loki yet to completion, so I can't really make a full comment on Loki. However, I've seen WandaVision, Falcon, Winter Soldier. I have seen bits and pieces of Hawkeye, but basically enough to know what it's about and so on. So in what sense, from what perspective would you like me to tackle that?
Really any, I mean, when you quoted the burden with glorious purpose, I was particularly like, oh, that's interesting. What is that quote really trying to say? Like, what are we supposed to think of Loki because of that quote stuff?
Right, so I borrowed that quote because of Loki's role in the Avengers, right? Because he is very clearly kind of posited as the bad guy in that film, but as we go further and further on in the Marvel canon, like, he's definitely not seen as the bad guy. He's definitely a foil, but he's not the antagonist in the strictest sense. So what becomes kind of an issue for me is that that quote becomes applicable not just to Loki as the character, but rather to, I'm going to coin a term here, Loki-ness of the entire Marvel Cinematic franchise and maybe even comic book media at large, right? Is that they're trying to do something, but the way they're doing something is so inscrutable to us peons on the ground that, like, we might not, again, to use another really, really shitty pun, we might not end up seeing the end game of that for a while. So it's hard to say, honestly, but I think that in the interim right now, what they're trying to do is they're trying to kind of, as Caitlin pointed out, have us deal with the generational trauma of 9/11.
Yes, I mean, there's also that, but I think particularly the newer ones, we've shifted from dealing with 9/11 in the modern parlance, in the zeitgeist. We've shifted to other bad guys. If you notice, it used to be all the bad guys were Russian, then all the bad guys were vaguely Middle Eastern. There's really no, like, physical trope for bad guys anymore, except maybe cops in some instances, but not all of them. Not enough to really make it cops are the bad guys.
Only the bad ones, you guys. Only the ones that, like, beat up Serpico.
Yeah. Anyway, so what we're dealing with now is we're dealing, like, the bad guys in zeitgeist right now are things like racism, sexism, homophobia, a lot of the things that have been generally negatively affecting a lot of the population for a long time. They just haven't been the bad guy. So I think that's sort of where comic book media is going, is because it's always been about dealing with things in a way that, you know, giving voices to people who are dealing with things that have not been in the zeitgeist before. So now that it's in the zeitgeist and now it's coming forward, I think that's really where we're going to sit, and we're going to sit for a while until the next big bad guy pops up.
All right, let's go ahead and take maybe one more question.
All right, yeah, unfortunately we are going to get kicked out of the room soon.
Sorry.
You're good.
No, you're good. Please.
I'm
come
glad
on
that
up.
people are like interested enough to ask questions and not just
Yes.
run away from us at the end.
Sure.
Well, okay. As a person who is young enough to have not really been affected by the generational trauma of 9/11, but who has been affected by what I think might be Gen Z's kind of generational trauma of school shootings. I did find in The Amazing Spider-Man the scene where the lizard breaks into the school, and then there's that scene afterwards where the students are being escorted out of the building by police. Do you think that there's any, I know you were just saying, maybe this is kind of redundant, I know you were just saying that you think it's going to be more concept-based, but do you think that there might be any sort of addressing of that sort of...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I would hope so. I think, unfortunately, that's, again, with 9/11, it's a little too fresh to be addressed right now. Granted, production times and the ability to respond to things happening immediately in movies is better now than it ever has been.
Right.
We're able to produce a movie a year after something happened to discuss it, which was not really possible in 2001. So I think it will be discussed a little sooner. But I think it is also, you're right, it's a trauma for a lot of people. And unfortunately, that the people that's a trauma for are not quite in the position to be making that media yet. But when they do, I absolutely believe that will be a big thing that gets discussed.
But I mean, I think that you pointed this out, that like they kind of are already talking about it. Like the very fact that a movie like The Amazing Spider-Man includes that, and it's very clearly meant to be an analog for that. Like the visual language of the movie supports this, right? And I know exactly the scene you're referring to. I think that conversation is definitely already being held. I can't think of any specific examples, but I know that over the past few years, I have watched, I think it's like Netflix TV shows that definitely have similar scenes in them. That
I mean,
are
there
kind
was
of
one in
incorporated into-
Degrassi.
Right.
Back in
Yeah.
the day.
This is true. And given that was a Canadian show, right?
Yes, it was a Canadian show.
Yeah. So
But yeah.
I mean, I think that like Caitlin said, there's a delay between like when they start figuring out how to address something like that in a way that's not just sort of like a boom, there it is, like one-to-one analog, and when they start putting out media like that, it's unfortunately almost always going to be like a 3 to 5 year delay.
Well, you can't process trauma the second it happens.
Right.
It takes time to deal with it
Yeah.
before you can even begin to talk about it to deal with it properly.
Yep.
But yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yep.
That's absolutely somewhere I think that these movies are going to start going.
All right, guys. So thank you all so much. We are going to wrap up because I think we're already.
We
on
are
the next
like 10
panel
minutes
time.
over. We're going to get yelled at.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much.